So in the last segment, I talked about the election of 1912, and you may recall that I said then, and I still think, one of the most important elections in American history. But the reasons why it's so important have to do with that progressive expression, because so many Americans pushed for, worked for, and voted for candidates espousing progressive ideas. Now, this election of 1912 brings Woodrow Wilson, a Southerner and a Democrat, to the White House. But the other telling thing about that election is that in 1912, the elections brought Democratic control to both houses of Congress. And what this means is we have Democratic Congress and a Democratic president. It's notable that Wilson will go and deliver, after calling a special session of Congress, he will actually go and address or deliver an address to Congress in person. And this is really the first time this has happened since, well, we can go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. But it's reflective of the fact that Wilson sees himself as party leader. He's going to Congress to speak directly to members of his party, not so much as the chief executive, not so much as the president and part of a different branch of government, but again, more in that sort of British system where you have a prime minister who remains a director of party actions and is sort of the head of the political party or faction within Parliament. Wilson sort of seems to see himself this way, and so that's part of the reason why he goes to speak directly to Congress. What this Congress and Woodrow Wilson will achieve is really just quite amazing, and it matches in many ways, though still not quite there, but in terms of legislation and what gets done, it matches or foreshadows perhaps what Franklin Roosevelt will achieve in the first 100 days and the first years of the New Deal. Just a sort of massive amount of legislation, progressive legislation in this case, that gets passed. Well, one of the first things to be done is to address the issue of the tariff. And the Democrats want to see the tariff lowered. This will lead in 1913 to the passage of the Underwood-Simmons tariff. That's Underwood-Simmons tariff, which brings about a reduction of 8% in the tariff. And let me just make sure we've got this. Tariff, remember, is a tax on imported goods, a duty or tax on imported goods, and it can be protective, but it also is a means of raising revenue. Well, this 8% reduction sort of sets the U.S. rates about where European tariff rates are. Wilson and many Democrats firmly believed that reducing the tariff and its protection of American corporations, manufacturing predominantly, would help to undermine this tendency toward consolidation, big business, and the creation of trusts and combinations. Because of party unity, because of Democratic control, this Underwood-Simmons tariff is passed. Now, one thing also to mention here, another point to make, is passage of the 17th Amendment. That's first proposed in 1912, goes through Congress, and then in 1913 we will see the ratification of the 17th Amendment, which opens the way for the direct election of senators. You may recall that this idea goes all the way back to the Knights of Labor, goes all the way back to the Grange in the 19th century. And it's here, following that 1912 election, that it finally comes to fruition as the 17th Amendment is ratified. But there's another important amendment to the Constitution that happens right here as well, and that is ratification of the 16th Amendment. See, the question was and had been for the Democrats, if we reduce the tariff and thus reduce revenue to the United States, how is that revenue to be made up? And one option that had been, again, on the table for decades was a graduated income tax. The 16th Amendment, which is ratified going back to 1913, opens the door for Congress then to pass legislation authorizing the collection of an income tax. One of the key figures pushing for this income tax and for the amended tariff will be Representative Cordell Hull of Tennessee. And that's going to be important in part because of Hull's position in the Democratic Party, but also because of the role he will play later on in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. So the constitutional change in the 16th Amendment had said that now a graduated income tax is possible, it's legal, it's constitutional. All Congress has to do, now in Democratic hands, is make it so. So, 1% tax on individuals and corporations making over $4,000. If you make over $500,000, a 6% tax. And by today's rates, I suppose that seems rather low. But remember, this is the first step. The first step and the introduction of a graduated income tax. And I didn't dwell on it, but if you think back to this notion of graduated income tax, what it begins to do is shift the tax burden away from property and toward income. Think of how the farmers who made very little often, but had to pay those extensive taxes on the land that they owned and that was the basis for their ability to farm, think of how that affects them, and then think about the Democratic Party's position since 1896 in relation to the populace, the alliance, and farmer interests, rural interests oftentimes. Another major piece of legislation from 1913 has got to be the Federal Reserve Act. This act fundamentally alters the way American currency flows through the economy and through the United States. It also begins a process of regulating America's banks and centralizing control of the currency. The Federal Reserve, of course, is still active today. You hear about it all the time in the news. But what it effectively did was to establish 12 regional banks. So we divide up the United States into 12 distinct regions, and each of those regions will have a regional bank. These banks will hold a percentage of the assets of all member banks. These assets will be held in reserve for such time as they're required. So in a sense, we're not talking specifically about government money here, but we're talking about a sort of insurance for banks who will hold back reserves or a particular amount of assets through this National Federal Reserve system of banking. Using that reserve money, the regional banks will be able to provide loans to private banks at interest or at discounts set by the Federal Reserve. Now, basically what this means is that the Federal Reserve banks for each region will be able to supply funds, capital, in times of need or when that capital is desirable at set interest rates, discount rates to independent banks. That means that the Federal Reserve banks will, in essence, be setting the interest rates, the amount of interest that these independent banks will have to charge on the loans that these independent banks make. It's through this mechanism, this interests and loaning of money or discounting of funds, that the Federal Reserve System can act as a brake on economic activity and inflation, or can release funds at lower interest rates to try and spur the economy to greater action. It's an amazing sort of mechanism. It's not all centralized. It's not a national bank. It's sort of a middle way compromise in a way, but it is regulatory. It gives great power to the Federal Reserve, and it's done with bank funds. On the other side of the equation, the Federal Reserve is also, it's federal, but it's federal in the sense of the national government will use the Federal Reserve to control the circulation of currency. If you look on, if you've seen the U.S. dollars, right? They're produced by the Federal Reserve. These banks had the power, were authorized to produce notes for the United States government. And all of this then would be controlled by a board, a Federal Reserve board appointed by the president. Okay. So through interest rates, through the determination of how much banks would have to pay to get access to reserves, and thus what kind of interest rates American citizens would have to pay, or international citizens would have to pay to get access to American capital, to loans, the Federal Reserve acts as a regulative brake or a fuel for the economy, depending on whether you're going through ups or downs. And remember, both, going back to 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, the United States had gone through that series of up and down, the ups and downs of economic boom and bust and depression. So potentially here, you might smooth out that cycle a bit with this tool in place. And then you also have, through the currency, through the banknotes, the capacity then to decide or determine how much money is actually in circulation. How much is to be printed, how much is to be withheld, and the reserves in the banks themselves become a sort of backing for this paper currency. This is a desire. The achievement of the Federal Reserve, arguably, is a desire that has existed in the minds of working people and farmers for decades again. I mean, for decades. If you go back and you think about the issues with currency that had existed in the 1880s and 1890s and how farmers complained about their inability to get credit at reasonable rates, how they had complained about the lack of currency available to them, how they suffered from deflationary policies and from the gold standard, you've got to understand that on a regional basis, addressing the needs of the West, addressing the needs of the South, individuated from the national kind of sense of need, but needs of region, the Federal Reserve is attacking these very issues that farmers and working people had complained about as being unfair and unequal, that they simply didn't have access to the same capital streams as the big business people, the sort of elite of American society. The other argument, of course, that historians have made is that in some very fundamental ways, the Federal Reserve didn't change a great deal. That it was, if anything, a true sort of progressive reform, because while it did establish mechanisms that did the things I've talked about, expanding the capacity to control the economy, but also to shape the economy regionally and extend credit more rapidly to make it more available. By establishing the Federal Reserve Board and putting your standard traditional kind of financiers in charge of that board, and then giving those financiers a tool to regulate the economy, well, historians have argued that really you were expanding the power of the sort of elite to manage things. And I think there's probably some substance there. That in a fundamental ways, while there's great change, what ultimately is being maintained is the status quo, that indeed the Federal Reserve is sort of it's a reserve position. It's a middle way. it's not so radical as it may at first seem, because while it gives a great deal to those radical interests on the farm and the lower classes, it holds back sufficiently to protect the basic structures of the American economy and to protect the interests of many of those who are already doing quite well. Well, by 1914, half of the United States banks had joined the Federal Reserve System. By the late 1920s, some 80% of America's banks were participating. It would be a working tool, and it remains just that today. There are a few other pieces of legislation, and I'll just mention them. But in 1914, Congress passed the Federal Trade Commission Act and also the Clayton Antitrust Act, both of which were designed to get at the root of the trusts, of the combinations. Specifically, both pieces of legislation offered a way for the growth of combinations to be stopped in the bud before they could really grow and develop. The Federal Trade Commission was put in place as a body that businesses could come to seek answers to the question of whether what they proposed in terms of combinations or in terms of mergers represented a potential restraint of trade that was unreasonable, whether their actions were would be considered illegal, whether they could be prosecuted under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Similarly, the Clayton Antitrust Act sort of furthered what was being done under the Sherman Act beyond just mere enforcement to suggest that certain behaviors could actually be considered illegal. Not just the construction of a trust, but for instance, things like being director of two corporations or offering pricing discounts that give a particular advantage to one or another competitor, thereby providing a tool to undermine that competitor and ultimately create a larger corporate entity. There were simply some behaviors that wouldn't be allowed under the law. Again, it reflects Wilson's sort of ideas. He doesn't care for the trust, but he's also not a big fan of using federal government to bust them. Rather, the idea is to catch these trusts, to catch these illegal operations while they are still in their infancy, before they can become the full-blown trust that Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft attacked, the sort of giants that they went after. Well, as you can see, I hope, 1913 and 1914, the first years of the Wilson administration, were really an expression of this sort of blossoming of progressive ideas turned into policy. In some ways, Wilson carried out the Roosevelt mandate in ways that Roosevelt simply never had. But the real takeaway here, as I see it, is simply to do with the power of progressive ideas in the United States in the years immediately prior to World War I. Now, in the next lecture, we'll talk a bit about the international situation in the early 20th century, and we'll also be talking about American entry into the First World War and what that meant. I'm going to come back in a subsequent segment, and I'm going to try to take this progressive emphasis one step further and see if I can argue effectively, and again, you don't have to agree, but see if I can argue effectively that much of what shaped how America's war effort in World War I was run, much of what made the home front work, was itself intimately tied to these progressive ideals that Wilson and the Democrats espoused.